Yeah. And so related to due diligence, let's talk about some of those elements because they really play into the technical pieces of what we look at. One of them, one of the proactive measures that we recommend is an IT risk assessment. Can you tell me a little more about what a IT risk assessment, what areas it will cover?
Well, typically when we do an IT risk assessment, we're going to pick a national framework standard to grade the organization
So not
against.
just your opinion.
Not my opinion. It may be my opinion of how close are you making to this national framework.
Sure.
But ultimately, we are looking at the organization as a whole, so the governance aspect that Justin may have alluded to in the first cast. But we also are looking at what are you doing around your infrastructure? Are you maintaining it? Are you maintaining your identity access so that do you know what your users are doing or how they're doing it? We look at the current inventory. Is it maintained? Are there risks associated with the software involved that you're dealing with? How are you accessing your network? What protections do you have in place around there? How closely can you monitor that? All of those aspects come into a risk assessment.
Even physical and logistical access, correct?
Sure, yeah. This is not just software access, but we're going to look at your
We're
facilities.
flipping keyboards to
Yeah,
see if
well,
there are
I mean,
passwords.
we're going to look for passwords. We're going to make
Yeah.
sure that you're using multi-factor or to access remotely because I mean that's one of the easiest ways to prevent some password hacking and those kind of things. So all of those areas are covered. And again, we typically pick a national standard. It's not just what Scott thinks is what we should do. This is always going to be a framework that has best practices built into it.
Sure. Well, one thing we hear a lot is, can my internal IT group do this? Or can our outsourced IT arm perform an IT risk assessment? Or we'll even ask in conversations and they'll say, oh yeah, we are doing it. Our IT resource is doing it. Tell me why you would say that would be a problem.
Well, initially, internally you should be looking at your risk. So you should be doing an internal risk assessment. But ultimately, that's not enough because you don't know what you don't know. You want a third-party expert to come in to be able to say, how well am I doing? As opposed to saying I'm doing well.
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest part of it is a neutral third party that has skin in the game on your behalf, but is not selling you a product at the end of the day.
Yeah, if you have an existing security provider that is providing services for you, it is in their vested interest for them to determine that those services are great.
Yeah, they don't want to get fired.
Right. Yeah. So in the same world, we're an accounting firm. The AICPA wants auditors to maintain their independence. We also believe that IT risk assessments should maintain their independence so that you are not getting recommendations for a product or a service that the company that just recommended it sells you.
Yeah, and I would say an additional reason to have a third party do it is that you're having someone help create a strategic plan that often supports what your internal IT is, but it's that checks and balance of saying, okay, what they asked for or what they recommended is valuable and accurate and correct.
Yeah, the risk assessments, we try to make them very collegial. We want to advocate to show that, look, your internal resources understand what you need and validate their concerns as well. So it's not always confrontational.
No, it really shouldn't be.
Fire.
Yeah, it really shouldn't be. In an ideal world, I would think that an IT risk assessment should be an organization coming in to take a look from a strategic standpoint along with the existing resource to say, hey, this is what's going well and this is what you might have gotten signed blind to and this is what you're missing because you're in here all the time.
Right.
Or you're not as educated or up to date on what you need to know, and that's kind of part of what a third party does is stay up to date. Yeah. So what should an IT risk assessment deliverable ideally look like, would you think, for the organization?
Well, I mean, ultimately you should get a comprehensive report that shows what were you graded against, what evidence was looked at, and then what weaknesses were determined, or what areas were you determined that you were sufficiently capable of maintaining. And then again, on top of that, what would be best practice to address any identified deficiencies? All of those pieces need to be in the report.
Okay.
Typically, I would not recommend a report that says you need to go buy X. That's usually a red flag.
Right. You have a vested interest in a product potentially.
Exactly.
If you're
okay. We also recommend, outside of just the assessment, is internal vulnerability scanning and external pen testing.
So explain the difference between those two things for essentially a layperson.
So I use the house analogy. So a pen test would be a penetration test of your firewall and from the web would be the equivalent of me pulling up to your house and getting out and trying to open the door. I'm going to jiggle the handle. I'm going to try to lift the windows, those type of activities.
So pause for 1 second, because a penetration test in definition is essentially an ethical hack. So an organization.
An attempted ethical hack.
Correct. One that's allowed, but is basically trying to simulate what someone with malicious intent would do and then exploit.
Right, trying to get access to the environment.
Okay.
Now, what an internal vulnerability scan is doing is, following up on our house analogy, is once I'm inside the house, what do I have access to? Where are the valuables? What can I get to? What internal doors are unlocked? So an internal vulnerability scan is going to look at the internal environment for all the software vulnerabilities that can be detected. What systems have software that needs to be updated because there's a known malicious exploit that's out in the wild, something along those lines. That report is very fluid because there's so many different variables in the internal environment that change so much. Those reports need to be done more frequently. The best practice recommendation is quarterly because those exploits are constantly being renewed, where a penetration test typically is an annual activity, or when you make a significant change to the perimeter of your network. So going back to the house analogy, if I change the doors on the front door, if I change the locks, I want to make sure that those locks work.
Sure.
But once I've changed the locks, I just want to check every once in a while that the door's still secure.
Yeah. So as a business consultant, for me to be talking to leadership of an organization, a vulnerability scan is valuable because it'll crawl the network, find what existing vulnerabilities occur. It also allows them to take an inventory and make some strategic capital expense decisions on top of identifying risk.
Well, yeah, we do identify outdated operating systems or even shadow IT, where you have systems in place that you may have forgotten about or may not be aware of existing. Those type of activities and it's all internal, so you're not exposing your network to any outside threat or anything along those lines. This is a scan inside the network, so it is safe in that sense, is that you're keeping it in-house.
Yeah, absolutely.